Sup guys, this is an in-depth guide for dive bombers and torpedo bombers in Azur lane. My goal with these in-depth guides is to take someone who knows nothing about equipment and make them an expert by the end. First, I'm going to do some housekeeping before diving into the meat and potatoes of the guide. This is a continuation from the last guide that I made on fighters, and I won't be rehashing everything that I've already mentioned in that video. So I would recommend watching that first if you haven't already. I will also be assuming that you know how armor types work, and if you don't, I have made a video which goes over what armor types are and how to determine the armor type of an enemy. Both of those videos will be linked in the description. I've also created a playlist specifically for these in-depth equipment guides, which will be linked in the description and regularly updated with new releases. I'm aware that actually going over the equipment takes up only a minor part of the guides, and it is by design. Obviously, these guides won't be able to directly cover every new piece of equipment that will come out in the future, so I want to primarily convey how to determine if a piece of equipment is strong, so that you will be able to apply the same principles to new equipment and figure out for yourself whether they are good or not. For example, since the Fighter's Guide, PR7 has dropped, and there's a new rainbow plane in town, the LA9. Similar to the BF-109G, it is a rocket plane. If you watched my Fighter's Guide and understood everything that I spoke about there, you should have the requisite knowledge to compare the LA9 with the old planes and figure out whether or not it is good. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's move on to dive bombers. Dive bombers are the least consistent and highest AoE type of plane. When an airstrike is launched, bombs are not dropped directly on top of the target, but in an area around the target. This area is determined by the spread stat of the bombs. The higher the spread stat, the bigger the area where a bomb can potentially be dropped. Bombs also deal AoE damage determined by their splash stat, which is the diameter of the AoE circle of the bomb. The bigger the splash, the bigger the AoE. To simplify things, there is a wiki page created by a user called Ricist which calculates the hit rate of bombs based on their spread and splash stats. Their methodology can also be found on the page, and I have a high degree of confidence in its accuracy from doing empirical testing with dive bombers. The most important part of this page are these two tables here, which list the hit rate of bombs by their spread and splash stats on enemies of small and large hitboxes. I believe the majority of ships that have humanoid sprites use the large hitbox, so in general, you only need to consider the second table. While the table also lists the damage of bombs adjusted for hit rate, do keep in mind that it doesn't have every single type of bomb listed. For example, let's take a 1000 pound bomb, which is listed here as 403 base damage. This is only the damage of tier 3 1000 pound bombs, so if the dive bomber has tier 0 bombs, it will be different than the damage numbers here, but the hit rate will still be the same if the splash and spread of the tier 0 bomb is the same. Looking at the list of fighters page, we can see that the Flying Flapjack has two tier 0 1000 pound bombs, each dealing 416 base damage at plus 10, which is not listed on the table, but it has 40 spread and 22 splash, so we can use any row in the table with the same spread and splash to obtain its hit rate, which in this case happens to be 48.51% against a large enemy. Applying hit rates to dive bombers is crucial to compare their average damage to each other, and sometimes carriers may have flex slots which can equip dive bombers or another type of plane, and you would want to be able to compare their performance to other, more consistent plane types as well. Dive bombers, as well as fighters with bombs, also scale to only 80% of the aviation stat, as opposed to 100% of other plane types. So you should multiply their damage by about 80% to get a rough estimate of how they compare to other plane types, although 80% is a bit of an underestimate. If you want, you can multiply it by 82% to get a closer estimate, but it depends on how much aviation the carrier has. Keep in mind that while rocket fighters do not scale to 80% of aviation like bomb fighters, all dive bombers scale to 80% of the aviation stat, including both the rockets and bombs of the 81 Sky Raider, despite it having rockets. Okay, with all of that out of the way, I think we should be ready to look at the list of dive bombers. When it comes to main fleet equipment, I almost always ignore the DPS column. When DPS is mentioned, this is what pops up in people's head. On the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have the total damage dealt. Suppose you have weapon A, which deals 30 DPS with 25-second cooldown, and dealing 750 damage every time it attacks. You also have plane B, which deals 35 DPS with a 17.5-second cooldown, dealing about 613 damage every time it attacks. When you typically think about DPS, it seems like on a large scale you would just have these two lines, one with a slope of 30 and one with a slope of 35, and clearly 35 would just be a strict upgrade. However, the DPS metric only works on a very large timescale. Given how long main fleet cooldowns are, damage looks more like this. Depending on where exactly the cutoff is, which is where the battle ends, it's possible for either weapon to be stronger than the other, so which one you choose has no correlation with their DPS values. When graphed like this, for any equipment that spikes over all others at a certain point in time, there probably exists some scenario where they are the best possible option. Therefore, rather than just looking at DPS, we should instead focus on how much damage each plane deals per strike and what their cooldown is. For Vanguard equipment, their damage uptime is much higher, so their graph much more resembles a smooth line, which means that DPS is a lot more relevant. Okay, we're finally ready to talk about specific dive bombers. I made a separate table here which just shows the total damage per strike of planes at plus 10, rather than their DPS. I hope I didn't make any glaring mistakes. For dive bombers that just drop bombs, the strongest is the Tenrai from PR4. It deals on average the most damage across the board, has the highest aviation boost, the overall highest amount of AoE, and even has a chance to inflict armor break to boot. At plus 10, it has a base damage of 432 per bomb with 3 bombs, which we can adjust with its average hit rate of 58.13% to about 753 damage on average. Despite it being the strongest regular dive bomber, since it has a relatively long cooldown of 12 seconds, it is not uncommon to be able to get an extra airstrike by sacrificing the damage of your dive bomber slot for a lower cooldown by replacing Tenrai with something like the Suisei Kai, which I will go over later. The other rainbow dive bomber is the AD-1 Sky Raider. It is much different from other dive bombers in that it carries HE rocket, and most of its damage comes from those. Since it deals damage via rockets, its use case is very different from other dive bombers and focuses on single target damage against light and medium armor enemies. When using rockets and aimed torpedo bombers, it is common practice to make sure the enemy is not moving so that you can consistently hit all their damage, whether by using Implacable, August von Parseval, other movement impairment effects, or just fighting a boss that doesn't move much. Therefore, it is a safe assumption to make that rockets have 100% hit rate when comparing them to bombs. The Tenrai, when adjusted for hit rate, dealt 753 base damage, which is 829 when adjusted for its medium armor modifier. The AD-1 has 8 rockets dealing 800 damage total, which is 880 after the medium armor multiplier. Therefore, even before accounting for its 1000 pound bomb, it is already stronger than the Tenrai against a single medium armor target, even more so against light armor. After adding in the bomb, adjusting for its hit rate and armor modifier, and summing together all of the damage, we get a total of 1083 damage on average, which is a lot more than that of the Tenrai. The difference is even bigger against light armor. However, the rockets rarely hit more than one target, so if there is more than one enemy, the Tenrai should still pull ahead. Compared to the Tenrai, its cooldown is even slower, so there's a good chance you might get one less airstrike with the AD-1 in a fight without planning ahead. All in all, while there are situations where the AD-1 is much more powerful than the Tenrai, it has fewer use cases and you're not missing out on much if you don't have it. You can only have one currently anyway, and if you don't have access to it, then your carriers with the dive bomber slot will suffer greatly against light armor enemies, but it's not the end of the world as you can always just use battleships with HE guns instead. Past the rainbows, the next most important dive bomber is the SB-2C Helldiver. Now, why did I skip all of the SSR dive bombers and go straight to the purple Helldiver? The answer lies in its payload. After adjusting for hit rates and armor mods, the SB2C wins out against all of the gold dive bombers across the board, with the exception of just 2, but those 2 exceptions come with their own issues. The SB2C is also available very early on in the game as a drop from Chapter 3-2 and from purple and gold Eagle Union tech boxes. So pretty much as soon as you start the game, you can get your hands on a dive bomber that is 75% as good as the best dive bomber in the game. Now, for the 2 gold planes that aren't strictly outdamaged by it, there is first the SB3C, which is pretty much a direct upgrade over the SB2C. The problem with this plane though is how much it costs relative to the upgrade you get in return. It is only obtainable via the Gear Lab and it costs 20 electronics, the most limited gold resource from Operation Siren, which is used for many better equipment, and 6 ordnance testing report, which can be combined to create rainbow ordnance in order to craft very limited rainbow equipment. Notice that old rainbow research equipment that are added to the lab, such as the Twin 457 and 22234, cost those rainbow ordnance, and the next in line to be added is going to be the aforementioned Tenrai, luckily costing the same rainbow ordnance. And for all those mats, what do you gain from upgrading from the SV2C? Not a single change in its payload. The only real difference between the 2 planes is the 20 aviation, which is approximately a 2% increase in total aviation damage. While the SB3C can be upgraded to plus 13, I do not recommend upgrading to plus 13 any equipment that is completely replaced by another later down the line with not even a niche use case. When you sort the wiki table by DPS, which does not take stats into account, you can see that the SB2C actually ends up having higher DPS because it deals the same damage per strike, but has 0.02 second lower cooldown. However, unless that 0.02 seconds makes a difference between getting off an airstrike and not, which it probably won't, the SB3C will outdamage the SB2C by a tiny bit due to the extra aviation. Aside from the SB3C, there is the SU2 from PR5, which only beats the SB2C against light armor due to its armor mods and is worse than the Tenrai across the board. It is not worth investing in, but you can use it if you already have it crafted for whatever reason. It is also just a tiny bit slower than the SB2C, so it's not very useful as a timing option either. All of the other dive bombers are just going to be timing options used solely for their specific cooldown. The most commonly used plane for situations where you need something with a lower cooldown is the Yokosuka Suisei Model 12A, or more commonly referred to as the Suisei Kai. Its cooldown is more than 2 seconds shorter than the Tenrai, so if you find that in a time-limited battle, like a meta fight, you're just a second or so short of getting off one last airstrike before timing out, then replacing your Tenrai or SB2C with the Suisei could potentially get you an extra airstrike and increase your total damage. Damage-wise, it's less than 50% of the Tenrai per strike on average. However, keep in mind that a carrier's damage comes from 3 different plane slots as well as barrages in many cases, so the carrier is not losing half their total damage replacing Tenrai with a Suisei Kai, just the damage of that single slot. Additionally, not every slot is equal. Take Ark Royal for example, who has a very weak dive bomber slot relative to her torpedo bombers. When you replace Tenrai with Suisei Kai on her, you're losing 50% from that slot, but that slot could be dealing 10% of her total damage, so you're really losing out on about 50% of that 10%, which is just 5%, in exchange for an entire extra airstrike, which would more than make up for it. Note that 10% is not an exact number, but just used to illustrate the example. And obviously, if using the Suisei does not result in an extra airstrike, then the Tenrai would be much better. Another notable dive bomber is the Fairy Firefly 1771 NAS. Its cooldown is right between the Suisei Kai and the Tenrai. Unlike most other 1,000 pound bombs, the bombs dropped by this dive bomber only has a spread of 33 rather than the usual 40, making its hit rate and by extension average damage much higher. Compared to Suisei, the Firefly deals about 50% more damage while still being noticeably faster than the Tenrai. Unfortunately, only one is obtainable from the Implacable event, so you either have it or you don't, but it's not super important and used very occasionally for when its slightly lower cooldown is enough to get your carrier an entire extra airstrike over using the Tenrai or SB2C. I also want to mention the Fairy Fulmar, which is at the very extreme in terms of cooldown. If you're using this thing, you can pretty much assume that your Dive Bomber slot will not be doing any damage. It's just so weak that even if you get an entire extra airstrike out of it, it wouldn't guarantee that the total damage would be higher than doing one less airstrike with a real Dive Bomber. It's also not that much faster than the Suisei Kai, but there are very occasionally situations where it does get you an extra airstrike over the Suisei Kai and results in the highest total damage. It is not difficult at all to obtain, so there is no need to craft it in advance. It's quite possible that you will never run into a situation where you need to use it, or else you'll be stuck. Maybe worth considering when you're already using the Suisei Kai, but are still short just a fraction of a second on the last airstrike in a timed fight. Again, I want to reiterate that this timing stuff mostly applies to timed fights. That is, fights which will time you out if you don't kill the boss in time. These include fights like the meta fights and Operation Siren boss fights, where if you time out, you're allowed additional chances to finish off the boss. In campaign, you should never really be timing out, so you should not be considering the Fulmar at all if you're just progressing through campaign. For all the other planes I did not explicitly mention, such as the base Suisei and the regular Firefly, they offer nothing special in terms of damage or speed that the ones I mentioned do not already cover. I won't say that there is no possible situation in all of the multiverses that there won't be some kind of situation where they are, for some reason, the best available option, but at that point, you probably cooked too hard. And that should be it for all the relevant dive bombers. Next, let's move on to torpedo bombers. Torpedo bombers are generally divided into two categories, parallel and converging, aka aimed. I feel like it's pretty straightforward what they mean, so let's get right into it. Parallel torpedoes excel when there are many enemies on screen and most of their torpedoes land. Against single target enemies, they are always outclassed by converging torpedo bombers, provided that you are using converging torpedoes properly, which means making sure the enemy isn't moving, either by brute forcing with movement impairment effects, or timing your airstrikes so that they land when the enemy's movement pattern happens to be stationary. The strongest parallel torpedo bomber, Wyvern, only has to hit 58% of its torpedoes or more to outdamage the strongest converging torpedo bomber. But if there is only a single enemy, forget about it. 58% is far too generous an estimate. When it comes to parallel torpedo bombers, Wyvern is the king. Not only does it drop the most amount of torpedoes at 4 torps per plane, but each of those torps also deal the highest amount of damage of any torpedo bomber. It also has the highest amount of aviation boost possible, being a rainbow plane, and it even intercepts enemy planes like a fighter. One of only 2 non-fighter and non-seaplane planes to have this feature. Past the Wyvern, there are only 2 other parallel torpedo bombers that drop 4 torps per strike, the Fairy Spearfish and the Douglas Sky Pirate. I will talk about the Spearfish after converging torps, but the Douglas Sky Pirate is in every way a downgrade from the Wyvern. There's not a single thing it has over the Wyvern, and it deals 85% of the damage that the Wyvern deals. The real killer of this plane though is that it is only obtainable through the Gear Lab, and it costs the same electronics that are used for crafting Wyverns. With electronics being as in demand as they are, I see no reason to craft an equipment that will eventually be fully replaced by another using the same mats. Since it is a USS plane, people who have a lower than middle school understanding of math may suggest that it is better than the Wyvern on independence, because your skill grants USS equipment 15% extra efficiency. Let's take a look at this claim. Independence has a base torpedo efficiency of 150%. An increase of 15% on top of 150% is a 10% increase. Let's apply a 10% increase to the Sky Pirate and see how much damage it deals. 288 multiplied by 1.1 is 316.8 damage, which is still significantly lower than that of the Wyvern, while being slower, giving less aviation, and providing no interception. There is also the parallel VIT torpedo bomber, which I forgot about, which is slightly stronger than the Sky Pirate on anyone other than Independence, but it is even slower than the Sky Pirate and also eventually replaced by Wyvern. I would not recommend sinking resources into it, even if it is not bad, because there are no situations where you need to use a parallel torpedo bomber other than the Wyvern, in my opinion. I personally have crafted just one, and I have not used it past the day that I crafted it. After the VIT-2 and the Sky Pirate, the rest of the torpedo bombers drop 3 or less torpedoes. The problem is that while they drop fewer torpedoes, the damage of those torpedoes are not higher either. The most easily obtainable parallel torpedo bomber is going to be the Fairy Barracuda, which deals about 63.5% of the damage of Wyvern. At that point, it doesn't really make a difference whether you use the Barracuda or an aimed torpedo bomber. The gap is so big that if I didn't have a Wyvern, I would just use an aimed torpedo bomber instead, even if there are many enemies and the Barracuda can get a decent hit rate, because the resources I put into the aimed torpedo bomber can be used effectively in single target fights as well. There are a bunch of parallel torpedo bombers that deal about as much damage as the Barracuda, such as Firebrand, Firecrest, Swordfish, and Brigette. All of them are going to be too weak for damage purposes. The Swordfish has a pretty good slowing skill on hit, which used to be quite useful once upon a time, but with the abundance of movement impairment effects going around these days, it is no longer useful, and I personally have not used it in years. The Brigette, like Wyvern, can intercept like fighters, and its cooldown is also quite short, making it occasionally useful for getting off an extra airstrike and worth considering if the interception can lead to your carriers staying hidden from enemy plane. The two VT-8s here are the same plane. It starts out as the weaker version and turns into the stronger version after the first airstrike. It's not worth using. The VT-18 is a bit stronger than the Barracuda and its friends, but again at most 75% of the Wyvern and weaker than the Sky Pirate. It can inflict flooding, but that's more useful when you're taking on a boss, but parallel torpedo bombers are generally only used against mobs, so it's not too relevant. Honestly, most of the parallel torpedo bombers are all pretty useless, but if you have them lying around, feel free to use them. The game is not hard, and unless you literally cannot clear the stage using them, then you don't really have to change anything. That's my advice for everything really. Only make changes when it is necessary to aid in beating content, and that way you won't waste resources, making intermediary upgrades that are totally unnecessary, like the Sky Pirate. There is also the Fairy Albacore, which is like the torpedo bomber version of the Fairy Fulmar, but it has no tangible difference from the Brigette cooldown-wise, unlike the Fairy Fulmar compared to the Suisei Kai. Okay, now let's talk about converging torpedo bombers. They're pretty straightforward because you don't have to worry about hit rate. They will always outperform parallel torpedo bombers against a single stationary target. How can I be sure that this is true? Well, you don't have to take my word for it. Just stick a parallel torpedo bomber into a single target fight, and count how many they miss on average. There are 4 gold ones and each of them have their own uses. The faster ones deal less damage while the slower ones deal more per strike, which makes sense. If you're not worried about reload at all, the new VIT-2 from PR7 is going to be the best option as it deals the most total damage per strike. From here on out, when I say VIT-2, I'm referring to the new Converging one from PR7 and not the old parallel one, which I said I never use. The Saiyun is the fastest by a noticeable margin and often fast enough that it can result in an extra airstrike in many endgame setups for meta fights. The Ju-87 and Ryusei are pretty much interchangeable as both their damage and cooldown are very close. The Ju-87 drops its torpedoes in a slightly different pattern than the others, dropping 2 of its 3 torpedoes slightly closer to the target, which leads to higher hit rates against moving enemies, but you should really set up your aimed torpedoes so that they all land regardless of which pattern you choose. Since the Converging VIT-2 is still relatively new, not many people will have access to it, but as people start getting more of them, I expect that Ryusei and Ju-87 will be phased out as they are neither the fastest nor the strongest. They will mostly see use in cases where they can squeeze out an extra airstrike over the VIT-2 without having to go all the way to Saiyuns. When it comes to converging torpedo bombers, there is actually a very good purple option. The Tenzen Kai upgrades from the regular Tenzen via the Gear Lab, using very easily obtainable purple materials. Looking at its damage, it's actually the exact same as the Ryusei. It is just slightly weaker because it gives less of an aviation boost, and its cooldown is a bit longer, albeit not by much. Also, the Tenzen Kai even upgrades into the Ryusei via the Gear Lab, so if you eventually do decide to upgrade, you will get your purple plates back. Going from Tenzen Kai to Ryusei is about as much of an upgrade as going from SB2C to SB3C, which is to say, not much, but Converging Torpedo Bombers do not have a rainbow option yet, like the Tenrai for dive bombers. Therefore, even when you're using the so-called budget option, it is 95% as strong as the best available option. You do not want to sit on the purple version forever though, as you will eventually want to upgrade Converging Torpedo Bombers to plus 13, which you can't do with purple planes. Okay, now there is just one torpedo bomber left, the Fairy Spearfish. Despite having 4 parallel torpedoes, I find myself generally using it more like a converging torpedo bomber than a parallel one. That is because it also comes with 4 rockets. The rockets are quite weak, but they perform the best against light armor, which is the weakest armor type for all other torpedo bombers. As a result, they do the best against light armor enemies on carriers that have no choice but to take a torpedo bomber. For example, Enterprise, who is quite good against light armor with an HVAR plus Sky Raider setup, but still has to have a torpedo bomber on her 3rd slot. Doing some algebra, we can see that it beats out the VIT-2 against light armor if it can hit at least 38.4% of its torpedoes, which is pretty realistic, and that is before accounting for its 20 extra aviation. However, it probably won't hit a lot higher than 38%, so the difference isn't too big. Its cooldown is much closer to that of the Saiyun than the VIT-2 though, so that is more of a fair comparison in most cases. To beat the VIT-2 against medium, it needs to hit at least 49% of its torpedoes, which will rarely happen against a single enemy. To beat the Saiyun though, it only needs to hit at least 42% of its torpedoes before accounting for its aviation, so I would say they're about tied. Also keep in mind that I'm assuming converging torps have 100% hit rate, but if the converging torps miss at all, perhaps because you're relying on a slow rather than a root, and a couple of the converging torpedoes are off the mark, then the Spearfish is more reliable. Also, if there are more than one enemy that you need to hit, like in the case of the Light Cruiser Arbiter and Gear Off Meta, then the Spearfish is going to be better than the aimed torpedoes against light and medium armor. So, while its use cases are quite limited, there are situations where the Spearfish is a considerable upgrade over the other torpedo bombers. One last thing I should mention is that I'm comparing the Spearfish at equal upgrade level to the converging torpedo bombers. However, you will likely want to upgrade the converging torpedo bombers to plus 13 because they're better against medium and heavy armor. They also cost 1/3 of the plates of the Spearfish as well. Keep that in mind when you consider if you really want to sink 360 gold plates on a Spearfish that is only a minor upgrade against light armor most of the time. I will also compare it to parallel torpedo bombers, which is just the Wyvern. Both of these planes are only obtainable through a lot of operations iron grinding. The Wyvern is superior in campaigns chapters 12, 13, and 15 due to its interception capability. Some people will say that if you have enough anti-air, then you don't need the anti-air from Wyverns, which is completely backward because you can just bring more damage elsewhere if you have anti-air from Wyvern. In chapter 14, while there aren't as many planes, there are still some, and on top of that, enemies are concealed, which ruins the aim of targeted damage like rockets and converging torpedoes. I made a short 3-minute video showing clear examples of this, so check the description if you want to know how concealment affects targeted damage in chapter 14 and occasionally chapter 15. Since Wyvern is completely unaimed, the concealment has no negative impact on it, making it relatively better. As a result, for almost all stages where there are enough enemies to warrant parallel torpedoes, Wyvern is superior. The only place where the Spearfish could arguably be better would be Operation SAR and mobbing, but that is totally unnecessary. Personally, despite having an abundance of Operation Siren material, I've only crafted a single fairy spearfish, and I don't feel any desire to craft more. With the LA9, Tenrai, Sky Raiders, and Wyverns, I can't bring myself to pour too many resources into this equipment, even though it is by no means bad and has places where it shines. Okay, that should be all the dive bombers and torpedo bombers done. Hopefully, I didn't miss any important information, but I am a one-man team, so I wouldn't be surprised if something slipped my mind. Feel free to let me know in the comments if I missed anything. In the next video, I will compare and contrast the different plane types and talk about their strengths and weaknesses relative to each other. It will be important to get a full understanding of carrier equipment usage. Anyways, I hope you found the video helpful. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.